Now we're going to look at Stonefruit temperature management and storage and shelf life prediction. Now, the models we developed to predict storage and shelf life and changes due to temperature along the supply chain were based on temperature by time experiments, fairly extensive air and sea freight simulation experiments, with using sometimes, in all cases, two different maturities, early or we can say unripe and commercial ripeness fruit from these two categories. We wouldn't use the ripe one because that's not appropriate for extended storage. And these models we developed eventually can be used with real-time temperature monitoring data, so to predict shelf life and storage life in real time as the fruit is being exported. That's the idea, to eventually be able to do that. And just make a note that we've determined that our shelf life prediction or storage life prediction models, the predictions have an accuracy realistically of 1 to 3 days, and you'll see what I mean. You get a prediction of you've got 2 days remaining, while it's basically 2 to 4 days with the uncertainty, and that's the best we can do because there is a lot of variability in the data. And then just to make a note, the export stages that we model or simulate, well, it's basically harvest through to freight forwarder, then the export component or leg, air or sea freight, an importer storage component, and then distribution and retailing, and finally consumer ripening, which is generally at 18 degrees. So the consumer keeping the fruit on their kitchen bench to ripen. So I'm going to go through and demonstrate, show you some calculators and how we can use them to look at changes in fruit quality. And when I talk about fruit quality, in this case, it's basically flesh firmness is the main quality indicator of interest that growers and exporters and other people along the supply chain use to determine stone fruit quality. So I just wanted to show you this as this was an air freight simulation experiment with Flavor Pearl Nectarine, that's an important export cultivar, and this was and Polloqueen peach, sorry. And this was an interesting experiment because what we did was we simulated air freight at 3 different temperatures, and you can see here at 8 degrees, 12 degrees, and 16 degrees for 24 hours. So we wanted to see what happens if the fruit is air freighted at what we would consider the 8 degrees, which was a standard air freight temperature, then at higher temperatures, so poor temperature management during the air freight leg. And we looked at flesh firmness, noting that the flesh firmness here is in newtons. If you want to get back to kilos, just divide that number by 10. So 50 newtons is around approximately 5 kilo firmness. So if we have a look at the results along, at harvest after air freight at the 3 different temperatures, and then storage for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks at 2 degrees. It's interesting that for Flavor Pearl, really the higher temperatures had very little impact on fruit softening, which would surprise most people, because you'd think, well, that higher air freight temperature, 24 for 24 hours, must have an impact, and that's what we believe. But when you actually do the trials, for example, for Flavor Pearl, you basically get no difference. So this has demonstrated how important it is to do these air and sea freight simulation experiments, because sometimes the results are surprising and counterintuitive. So for Flavor Pearl, really, that 24-hour period of higher temperatures has very little impact during subsequent storage. But for Polloqueen peach, there is an impact of that higher air freight temperature. As you can see, the higher air freight temperature does have a significant impact as we store the fruit longer. So it's very much how temperature impacts on cultivar, on how temperature impacts on subsequent storage potential is very much it seems to be determined by the cultivar itself. That's why we have to have a good understanding of the cultivars we're using, because it's not always intuitive, the effect of temperature on subsequent storage potential. And just showing you what a temperature time experiment is. This is from Majestic Pearl. What we basically do is we take samples of fruit and we store them at different temperatures for different storage periods. And so we come up with these sort of, this is for flesh firmness, these changes in flesh firmness at different temperatures and for different storage periods. And with that data, we can develop models to actually predict storage life as the temperature along the supply chain changes, say from 2 degrees up to 8 degrees and back to 4 degrees. We're actually able to model what happens to the quality of the fruit, or the flesh firmness of the fruit anyway. And now I'm going to demonstrate how we can use those models to predict what happens to fruit in an export chain. So this is looking at the impact of temperature and storage duration on fruit softening, so on flesh firmness. And this is for a white flesh nectarine, let's say. And using this model, typically growers and exporters might have questions such as, what is the actual impact of 3 days at 8 degrees during export, or 12 hours at 16 degrees? How do we know what the actual real impact is on fruit quality? We can take a guess, but something like this gives us much better information and quantitative information. What is the impact of high air freight temperature on fruit quality? Well, as we've seen, it's cultivar dependent, and it's hard to determine sometimes. And we're hoping this kind of calculator can assist growers and exporters to sort of get a feel for what's happening to their fruit during export. So if I double click, and before I double click to run it, you can actually set the flesh firmness at harvest of your fruit. So that at the moment it's 8 kilos. I'm going to leave it there, but you can change that to 7 or 6 kilos depending on the cultivar. And that will be your starting point for firmness as you run the calculator. And now the model assumes a maximum of 4 to 5 weeks storage period from harvest to the consumer, and no storage disorders. So we're not trying to model fruit that are likely to have storage disorders, which sort of throws the model out of whack. So this is for fruit that behaves normally during storage. 8 kilos flesh firmness at harvest, and we can start putting in some numbers. So just to show you how the firmness changes. So I'm going to leave the temperatures as are, and we'll do air freight initially. So let's assume that the air freight temperature is 8 degrees. Average temperature between harvest and freight forward is 3 degrees. Importer storage is 4 degrees. Distribution at 5 degrees, and then the consumer ripens the fruit. So if we, realistically, 5 days between harvest and freight forwarder, let's say 2 days at 8 degrees, the air freight leg. Importer storage, I don't know why that's not changing. Let's try 5 days. There we go. So what's interesting is the model really is telling us that not much happens in these early stages, even at 2 days at 8 degrees and 5 days at 3 degrees. Very little. I mean, the average firmness, there's an uncertainty there, but it's probably 0.5 kilos, 7.5 to 8.5 kilos. So not much happens initially, but once you start moving into the chain at different temperatures, then your flesh firmness is dropping, and then you might, I don't know, I'm guessing say 4 days realistically and as you see, as the days of storage accumulate, and obviously different temperatures are encountered, your flesh firmness starts dropping off. And we find that among most cultivars that you've got an early period where not much happens unless you've got extreme temperatures, which these aren't, and then you get quite a rapid drop off. And then the consumer purchases the fruit, might keep it, and it's 3 days on the kitchen bench and you're down to eating firmness. So that might be an example of looking at an air freight scenario. We can look at a sea freight scenario where now we've got a temperature of say 2 degrees and we've got, let's say, 24 days of sea freight. So at the end of sea freight, you've got, it has dropped off, it's still okay, but we're estimating a flesh firmness of 5.6 kilos. And then importer storage, if we keep everything the same, well, then it's, by the time you've gone to distribute to the retailer, you're already down to 1.6 kilos. So you can see that for sea freight with that longer storage duration, you do get an impact on firmness. But if the importer can market the fruit very quickly, say 2 days, then you've got given yourself, or the importer's given themselves some time to get the fruit to the retailer, for example, at a reasonable firmness. So that is just an example of how we can use this calculator to look at different export scenarios and get a feel for what happens to the quality of the fruit. So again, we've demonstrated this to a number of growers and exporters, and they said it's very useful because it's quite difficult for them to determine for any particular cultivar what is the likely impact of temperature. Well, this is giving them some idea. So I'm going to go back to full screen and finish off with looking at estimating sort of remaining shelf life. This is using the same data as for the previous calculator, but looking at the modeling something different, which is remaining shelf life or storage life. So this is probably more useful than the other calculator in terms of it's actually giving you some commercially applicable information. I'm at this stage in the supply chain, how much remaining shelf life has the fruit got, basically. So this is a calculator that can be used, for example, by the importer. I mean, it can be used by either supply chain members, but the importer, and the importer or whoever's using it can set a minimum firmness here, at which point they want to distribute or sell the fruit. So in this case, we'll say that once the fruit gets to 4 kilos, the importer wants to sell it. So then you can start putting in some numbers and get a remaining shelf life. So harvest to freight forwarder, again, 5 days. If we do let's do a sea freight scenario. Okay, and it tells you, yeah, that's fine, continue. And so you put all the numbers in and then you can look at the final result. Again, 24 days at 2 degrees. Right. The importer at this stage has 2.6, after the export leg, the importer has 2.6 days to sell the fruit before it reaches that 4 kilo minimum. And obviously, if they store it for 1 day, then they've got 1.6 days left to sell it. So you can see it's a pretty powerful tool because for the importer can estimate the remaining shelf life based on a minimum flesh firmness. And if we change that to 5, it should minimum firmness reach. So basically, what this is indicating is that if you have to sell the fruit before it gets below 5 kilos, then this is already, you've gone beyond that time. If we change that to 0.5, it might, no. So if we change, let's change that to 21 days, you've got a perfect export. Right, so if you've got 21, you receive the fruit after this export leg, you've got, you virtually have to sell the fruit straight away within a day if you're looking at 5 kilos as your minimum before dispatch. So you can play around with this and it gives you some really good commercially important, I guess, information. And we can do the same thing from a retailer perspective. I'm not going to demonstrate it because it's similar to the previous calculator. Again, the retailer can set a minimum firmness by which time they have to sell the fruit and put in some numbers there and actually demonstrate and then determine what the remaining shelf life is. So, obviously in this case, I haven't put anything in, but it will tell you, yes, you can continue, you haven't reached the minimum. And then at some point it tells you, how the retailer will know how long they've got based to sell the fruit based on what's happened prior. And, eventually we want to be able to set this up on an online dashboard on the web that can be accessed by growers and exporters, and they can play around with different scenarios and again get a feel for how remaining shelf life. But ideally we want to be able to use this in real time, so put in actual real-time temperature data and then use it in real time to calculate remaining shelf life. But I mean, we're looking at that in sometime in the medium term, because it's not an easy thing to set up. So to finish off, outcomes. So from the service supply chain project, we've demonstrated firstly that these air and sea freight simulation trials, export simulation trials, can inform cultivar storage potential. I mean, they can be used, these trials can be used to give us a really good handle on export cultivars and the storage potential and even, as you've seen through the models, shelf life potential. And we're able to conduct these trials under commercial and export conditions. Stepwise cooling, we've determined that it appears at the moment to significantly reduce potential storage disorders in the cultivars we've looked at, and we expect the same result for other cultivars. And it could be an important process that can be implemented by the grower to reduce that potential, particularly for sea freight export. Then we've looked at the real impact on quality as a result of different temperatures and storage durations, and they can be understood using these storage and shelf life models and these calculators. But saying all that, good temperature management obviously is very important, but the temperature impacts on quality depend on the cultivar. At the end of the day, depend on cultivar and the storage period. Okay, so we've got to remember that temperature, the same temperature can impact a cultivar differently depending on what that cultivar is, its genetics, and the storage period. And also we've found that more temperature monitoring is required, especially from harvest through to the freight forwarder for export, and then beyond export, so during importer storage and retail. Thank you very much for your time.